Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Seed Talk. My name is Layne, and we've been getting a lot of questions lately about what to do if your fall planted cool flowers start budding up or even trying to bloom before winter. In this excerpt from episode 63, which was all about troubleshooting premature blooms, Lisa and I talk about what to do for overeager branching and single stem plants. Enjoy! So now we're going to talk about what you should do for your plants if this is happening. And I'm going to break it up into branching and single stem. So what would you do, Lisa, if you have, let's say, Sweet William, it's a branching plant. What would you do if you started to see buds set after you've planted it out there in the field?
Okay, so I tend to first off not do anything until winter, until the cold weather starts. Because if you pinch a plant and it's still warm conditions out, the plant is just going to continue to grow more stems, right? I mean, it's going to do what it's going to continue doing that. And the only time that I actually pinch in the fall winter time is if the stem is really getting tall. If it's over 12 or 18 inches, which just makes it more vulnerable to cold damage and wind whipping. But I use row covers for wind protection, so that's not as much as a threat, because pinching stresses plants. And for a stressed plant to go into a stressful season of cold is just kind of a double whammy. So my preferred method is to ignore it in the fall and winter, and then in very early spring, and I say that over and over, very early spring. Very early spring, as we define it, is 6 to 8 weeks before your last spring frost. So for me here in southeastern Virginia, that's like Valentine's Day. That's when our second planting of cool flowers goes in, but that is also the time that I'll take down covers, not necessarily leaving them off, sometimes we do, and patrolling for that type of behavior. And that's when I would pinch them, because excessive pinching leads to puny stems because the plant overproduces.
So even if you see a plant with all these buds on it, or what if it's even starting to bloom, would you still just leave it there?
Yep. So if it's that big and large, then I might cut it. But because we use, if it'll fit under a row cover, under the low tunnel, I might just leave it. But usually, first off, I don't see this behavior in like all the plantings of a particular plant. There's always like one or two renegades, right? That just kind of like shoot it up. So I don't feel so bad about cutting it back in winter, which stresses it and risk killing the plant. It just won't recover is what happens. So you just kind of have to go with it. And again, it's usually not so many plants that, oh, well, if you feel like cutting it, cut it. And if it doesn't survive, guess what? You got a bunch of other plants.
So if it's really large, you might consider cutting it. If it fits under a row cover, you would just leave it there,
Right.
buds and all, and see what happens in very early spring.
Yes.
Okay, how about for a single stem plant? What if someone's growing a single stem stalk and they see it starting to put on buds or even bloom? What would you do in that case?
Leave it. I mean, there's no recourse because it's a single stem plant. And oftentimes, as trying to remember, last year for Chinese forget-me-nots, which are in fact are not single stems, they're multiples, but they, just like stock, oftentimes, and stock is a single stem, oftentimes will set their buds while the stems are fairly short and kind of give you a little heartburn thinking, oh my gosh, they're not going to be very tall. What am I going to do with those, And in fact, they really put on the acceleration extension during the last days. So for a single stem, you have no recourse but to leave it. You need to take care of it. You need to be sure that you're watering it properly and that it has the nutrition it needs. But I find our stock, the first cut is kind of squatty, but then they just start elongating and getting it. So be patient is the bottom line. Stop being a helicopter plant grower, which is what we're all guilty of, right?
Oh, yes, because we love them.
Exactly. Hovering is okay, but you can't let it make you make the wrong decision.
Now, what if someone had an entire bed of stock, for example, and pretty much all the plants are actually blooming?
I'd still leave it. I mean, let it bloom out because you just don't know. And again, like the one that you're looking at there that's in this image. And again, reminder to everybody, Layne always makes a beautiful slideshow to go along with our podcast that you can see over here on YouTube. You just don't know what the plants are going to do, but there's no recourse. You either count it a loss and leave it, or pull it out. There is nothing to be done.
Yeah. So what if someone has these plants row covered? It's a nice cozy environment under there. Would you recommend taking that row cover off to kind of cool the plants down just a touch?
Yeah, so that would definitely work. Growing slow, low, and cool tends to help plants grow more roots and more stem length. So if you, and let's just say, so we plant stock in February. Valentine's Day is kind of like our key marker. And we typically cover because it's still really cold outside and a lot of whipping wind, right? So we cover after we plant. And if they start setting buds and misbehaving that way, then yes, I would uncover them to kind of take away that added warmth. So yeah, that's a great point.
And what is your track record? It's going to be different for everyone and depending on where they live and the weather, the winter conditions they have that year. What's your track record on these plants? Maybe it's a larger plant and it has some bud set. What do you typically find in very early spring when you go to look at those plants?
The ones that set buds and were problem childs all through winter.
Right.
I mean, usually, again, just saying that there's so few of when that does happen, let's just say in the Rudbeckia bed. I mean, if I get, and we plant typically now, we plant, less than 100 plants usually per variety. In high production, we would have entire 100-foot beds of just say Indian summer, right? That 100-foot bed of Indian summer might have 5, maybe up to 10 short setters. So there's so much more abundance of everything else. You really rarely pay attention to it. But I have seen, like in Sweet William, that's another really great offender, right? The one that does it.
Right.
Sometimes when I'm cutting, you're in April and May and you're out there just cutting the tons of cuts, like this image of Amazon that you have displayed here, Sweet William. You cut all those stems that we're looking at, and then down in the understory, you see 3 or 4 of those little shorties that actually set bud and bloomed in fall, and they look exactly the same. So I just kind of count them off, I mean, we don't rely on them.
If someone is experiencing this widespread in a bed, would you recommend, if they have time, if they believe they're going to be able to restart and they have the bed space, would you recommend they do another planting to be safe?
Sure. I mean, yes, but I just don't think that is really, for us, we've never experienced that. Let's put it that way.
So Lisa, any final words for someone who's stressing out after finding some of their plants budding up this fall?
Sure. I would say, first off, don't be alarmed. It happens to all of us. It's more about the plants than you or what you've done most often. And just feel confident that you can just leave it alone and rectify it in very early spring before the plants start growing again. Snipping off that little shorty that went through winter may stimulate more stems to actually grow from that plant. But this is also just another great example of why we always plant more than what we think we need to cover those kinds of issues, right?
And again, if this is something you seem to be experiencing every year on a large percentage of your plants, really consider experimenting with planting a bit later and maybe even doing some of that succession seed starting that we mentioned earlier, just as an insurance policy for some of the plants that seem to give you the most trouble.
Yep.
Well, I hope these tips will be helpful for those of you experiencing premature budding up or blooming on your fall planted cool flowers. Feel free to check out the full episode, which was episode 63, if you'd like to hear more about what can cause these premature blooms and which flowers seem to be the most prone to doing this. This podcast is brought to you by the Gardener's Workshop, so if you have a need for any seeds, tools, supplies, or online courses, feel free to hop on over to thegardenersworkshop.com and check it out. Thanks so much for joining us. Please be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're watching or listening. And until next time, happy growing!